Hello, everyone. Today we're going to summarize the most significant moments of the Civil War. Now, I do want to point out that the Civil War might have been the single most important conflict in our nation's history. And we're about to boil it down to just a few minutes. So the Civil War is actually a huge, huge topic that we could spend years talking about. In fact, there are books written about the Civil War every single day. So I don't want to downplay this significant event in our history. However, I do want to highlight some of the key events that happened, as well as some of the big developments that brought about change in our country because of the Civil War. So that's what we're going to do, okay? Starting with a few facts about the Civil War. The Civil War led to 620,000 American deaths. Now, this is significant because when we count the deaths in the war, we end up counting both sides as American. A civil war, by definition, is when a country goes to war against itself. And so in this case, both sides of the war are in fact American lives, whether you're from the North, which called themselves the United States of America, as we still do today, or if you were from the South, which called themselves the Confederate States of America, but they ended up losing the war, so they were brought back into the United States of America. So 620,000 Americans died in the Civil War. Just to help you understand how many that is, that's more than World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War, and Korean Wars combined, okay? It's 25 times more deaths than the Revolutionary War. So we heard about the Revolutionary War already this year. The Civil War had 25 times more American deaths than the Revolutionary War did. So the Civil War is without a doubt the bloodiest conflict that has ever occurred in American history. The Civil War involved friends, neighbors, and even brothers facing each other on the battlefields. If you were from one state in the South and you joined the army, there's a chance that your brother from a state up in the North was also joining that army, and you could face each other on the battlefield. So this wasn't a war where strangers were going to far off places and fighting. People were fighting in literally their own backyards, in their own fields, right here on American soil. And so they often did know the person that they were facing on the other side of the battlefield. There were 10,500 military engagements and 50 major battles in the Civil War. So as you can imagine, a huge conflict involves a lot of battles, and we are not going to be covering all 10,000 plus of them. We're going to be highlighting a few key pivotal events from the war. There was a nurse named Clara Barton who started the American Red Cross during the Civil War. So some good things came out of this war as well, including the nonprofit organization of the American Red Cross. That's the same Red Cross that today shows up to do disaster relief and gets involved with healthcare and other community services that promote general health and well-being. So thanks to Clara Barton being a battlefield nurse during the Civil War, we have the American Red Cross still today. The first American war, it was documented by photography, which is pretty cool if you think about it. It means that people were actually able to see pictures of the conflict showing up in their newspapers back home. So photography was a thing during the Civil War, and it was the first American war that was able to actually show people what was happening on the battlefields, both the gruesome and the victorious. And then finally, the Civil War brought about some real advancement in technologies, which wars often do, which on one hand is really, really sad that most of the time in a war, we're trying to figure out how can we win the war, which really translates to how can we kill our enemy more efficiently? And so the Civil War brought about some really fascinating advancements in technology for the purpose of killing the other side. But then later on, some of those things could be used for the good. So some examples of inventions that came out during the Civil War were repeating rifles. So in other words, machine guns, those are deadly killing machines, but they were developed during the Civil War. We also have submarines, right? Submarines were invented and created during the Civil War, as well as ships made of iron instead of wood, right? We've got railroads, which already existed. However, we started using railroads so much more during the Civil War in order to transport soldiers and supplies to and from different battlefields. So the Civil War really brought about the advancement of railroads. Same thing with the telegraph. So both railroads and the telegraph already existed just before the Civil War, but the Civil War really advanced them as technology. Both things that led to the good and development of society and American humanity after the war. Telegraph being a form of communication where you can actually talk using Morse code across the country. And railroads obviously revolutionizing transportation so that we could go from one place to another in the country much more efficiently. So again, war is bad, but sometimes we can use some of the developments from war to do really, really good things much later, right? We're going to summarize some of the key events that happened during the Civil War, okay? So starting in December 20th of 1860, that is when the Southern states seceded. So to secede means to break away. Remember, those states in the South felt like their way of life, namely slavery, was being threatened. And so because of that, they left the United States and they formed their own Confederate States of America. And that became official in February 9th of 1861. So the Southern states called their own country the Confederate States of America. They elected their own president. His name was Jefferson Davis. They had their own capital city in Richmond, Virginia, which strangely is really close to Washington, D.C. So the two countries' capital cities were really close to each other. They printed their own money. They elected their own government officials. They had their own laws. They were, for all intents and purposes, their own country. And they stopped following the United States laws and they started following their own. Then the attack on Fort Sumter is what officially started the Civil War. And in this case, it was the Confederates or the Southern states that started the Civil War. Ironically, though, they were attacking a fort in the South. Now, here's why. The Union, so the United States, still had military posts throughout the Southern states. So even though the Southern states became their own country, the United States was like, no, you didn't. And so they kept their military in those Southern states. And so the Confederates actually attacked the Union Army, who was still posted in South Carolina at Fort Sumter. And that was the first official battle of the Civil War. After that, it would be the Northern Army or the Union Army or the United States Army that would invade the South. And most of the battles of the Civil War would end up taking place in the Southern states. I talked about ships being made of iron. In 1862, there was the famous Battle of the Ironclads between the Merrimack and the Monitor. Each side had their own ship made out of iron, and this changed naval warfare. A ship made of metal against a ship made of wood, the metal ship is going to win. But in this case, we have two metal ships going against each other at sea, and it ended up ending in a draw. There's no clear victory from that battle. Both ships ended up just pommeling each other and then kind of drifting away from each other at the end. But that revolutionized naval warfare, and we would now have a lot more ships made of iron and many more battles at sea. The next one was the Battle of Antietam. Now pay attention. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest day in American military history. And at the Battle of Antietam, the Union stopped the Confederates. So the Union is considered the victor or the winner of that battle. So it was, in fact, the bloodiest day, meaning the most deaths and the most casualties, the most injuries, one of the worst battles that the United States had ever seen to that point. Okay, but the Battle of Antietam took place over one day. So it was, in fact, the bloodiest day in American history. You'll understand why I'm emphasizing the word day in a moment. After the Battle of Antietam, Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. In other words, he freed the slaves. And we're going to have a separate lesson on just that one thing, the Emancipation Proclamation. So that was a huge pivotal moment in the Civil War when Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves in the Confederate States. Then after that was the Battle of Gettysburg. And the Battle of Gettysburg was probably the turning point of the war. Up until then, the Confederates kept on winning and winning and winning and winning because they had the home field advantage. Most of the battles were fought in their territory. They also had this strong cause of fighting. The Confederate States were fighting for their independence. They wanted to be their own country, free from the United States. Whereas the United States was more like, we're fighting you to bring you back. And that wasn't as strong of a cause for them. And so the Confederate States were winning the Civil War until the Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg really was a turning point. And after Gettysburg, things wouldn't look so good for the South for the rest of the war. The Battle of Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle in all of American history. So I hope you heard the difference there. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest day, but the Battle of Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle. Here's how that works. The Battle of Gettysburg took place over 3 days. Okay, so all 3 of those days combined, Gettysburg was by far the bloodiest battle in American history. All right, we lost more American lives at the Battle of Gettysburg than any other day in our history ever. The Battle of Antietam was the bloodiest day because it only took place in 1 day. So 1 day at Antietam was worse than any of the 3 days at Gettysburg. But Gettysburg was 3 days, so you combine those 3 days, and Gettysburg was the bloodiest battle in all of our history. On November 19th, a few months later, President Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. That's a famous speech that he delivered, which really captured the purpose of this war. It gave them a renewed cause. Previously, the war was just about bringing the Southern states back into the United States. But now it's becoming apparent that the war is now also about freeing the slaves. And this is a much more noble cause, and it gave the North a renewed sense of fighting. It gave them a real purpose. They were not just fighting to bring the South back, they were also fighting to end slavery, which to them felt like a much more significant cause. Then there was Sherman's March to the Sea. General William Tecumseh Sherman led his men from Atlanta, Georgia to Savannah. And all the while, he destroyed everything in their path. In some places, the path of destruction was over a mile wide. And he basically ordered his men, burn it all, destroy everything you see, steal their pigs and their cows and eat them. He wanted to split the South into 2. and he effectively did that. The South never really recovered from Sherman's march to the sea and all the devastating destruction that took place. Gettysburg was certainly the turning point for the war, but Sherman's march to the sea kind of sealed the deal, right? Then after that, Congress would pass the 13th Amendment. So now it would become official. In the United States Constitution, slavery would become illegal. So the 13th Amendment was a pivotal moment, and it showed us, okay, when the North wins the war, now it's really going to be official, because if the South has to join the United States again, well, the 13th Amendment just made slavery illegal. So when the North wins the war, slavery will also come to an end for the South. And then finally, surrender occurred in 1865 in a town called Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, where General Lee surrendered to General Grant. And that marked the end of the Civil War. And then shortly after that, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He was killed by an actor from the South while he was watching a play take place in a theater in Washington, D.C. And so Lincoln would not be the leader that ends up restoring the country back together again. It's going to be up to his vice president, Andrew Johnson, to become president and bring the country back together. We're going to spend some time talking about that next week. Okay, so there's a basic rough timeline of some of the most significant events that happened during the Civil War. And like I said, we'll have another specific lesson about the Emancipation Proclamation, because that one is kind of a big deal. All right, there you go. We just summarized the most significant moments of the Civil War.